Sometimes the people who tell you that you do not belong are the very ones who forgot where they came from. I never imagined those words would describe my own family, but that is exactly what happened on a warm Saturday afternoon in central Kentucky. Every summer, the Whitmore family gathered at my grandmother Evelyn's farmhouse for a reunion that had been a tradition for more than 50 years. Relatives traveled from across the country, bringing homemade food, folding chairs, old photographs, and stories that seemed to grow richer with every passing year. As children, my cousins and I ran through the fields behind the barn until sunset. As adults, we returned hoping to reconnect with the people who had shaped our lives. At least that was what I believed family reunions were supposed to be. My name is Claire Whitmore, and until recently I thought blood was enough to guarantee a place at the family table. I was wrong. My father, David Whitmore, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness. Since then, life had changed more quickly than I ever expected. Medical bills had forced me to sell the small house where I grew up. I accepted a teaching position in another town and rented a modest apartment while rebuilding my life one careful step at a time. I did not become wealthy, but I learned how to appreciate simple things again. Through everything, Grandma Evelyn never missed a birthday card or a Sunday afternoon telephone call. She always reminded me that difficult seasons never lasted forever. When the invitation for the annual reunion arrived in the mail, handwritten in Grandma's familiar cursive, I smiled for the first time in weeks. She ended the note exactly as she always had. Come hungry, come early, and remember that home is wherever you are loved. Those words stayed with me during the 2-hour drive to the farmhouse. I even stopped at a local bakery to buy Grandma her favorite pecan pie because she insisted nobody baked it quite the way they used to. As I pulled into the long gravel driveway, expensive sport utility vehicles and luxury sedans already filled most of the yard. My older cousins had become successful attorneys, real estate developers, physicians, and business owners. I felt slightly out of place arriving in my aging compact sedan, but I reminded myself that Grandma had never measured people by what they drove. Carrying the pie carefully in both hands, I walked toward the backyard where laughter echoed beneath the giant oak trees. Long wooden tables were covered with white tablecloths, fresh flowers, and enough food to feed an entire neighborhood. For one brief moment, everything looked exactly as I remembered. Then my cousin Rebecca noticed me. Her smile faded almost instantly. She quietly whispered something to her husband before walking toward me with an expression that felt unusually formal. Before I could even hug her hello, she gently blocked my path and said there must have been some misunderstanding because this year's gathering was intended only for immediate family. I stared at her in complete disbelief, certain I had misunderstood what she had just said. But as more relatives turned to look in my direction without speaking, I realized the misunderstanding was not mine. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Rebecca kept one hand lightly resting against the edge of the folding table as though she were politely guarding the entrance. Behind her, conversations had become noticeably quieter. A few relatives pretended to arrange serving dishes while secretly watching us from the corners of their eyes. Others looked away altogether, unwilling to become part of the moment. I forced a small smile and held up the pecan pie. I told Rebecca that Grandma had invited me personally and that I had even brought dessert because I knew it was her favorite. Rebecca glanced briefly at the pie before looking back at me. She lowered her voice and explained that everyone had agreed the reunion would be different this year. According to her, the family wanted to focus on those who had remained closely involved with family traditions. She insisted it was nothing personal. Those words hurt more than if she had simply admitted she did not want me there. I quietly reminded her that my father was David Whitmore, Grandma Evelyn's youngest son, and that I had attended every reunion since I was old enough to walk. Rebecca sighed before explaining what she believed everyone else was already thinking. She said I had moved away, sold the family house, rarely attended holiday gatherings after Dad passed away, and no longer seemed connected to the family. Before I could answer, another cousin, Brian, walked over carrying a glass of iced tea. He greeted me politely but supported Rebecca's position. He suggested it might be easier if I visited Grandma another day when the reunion was over. He claimed today's event had become very crowded and that emotions had already been running high because several relatives were discussing future plans for Grandma's property. Hearing those words immediately caught my attention. Grandma's property had never been the center of our reunions before. Those weekends had always been about family, homemade food, and old memories. Suddenly the atmosphere around me made much more sense. Several expensive vehicles filled the driveway, conversation seemed unusually formal, and many relatives wore business attire instead of casual summer clothes. It no longer felt like the reunions I remembered from childhood. It felt like something else entirely. I looked across the backyard searching for Grandma Evelyn. Normally she would be the first person waiting on the front porch to welcome every guest with a warm embrace. Today I could not see her anywhere. I asked where she was. Rebecca hesitated before answering that Grandma was resting inside because the excitement had become overwhelming. She quickly added that everyone wanted to keep her calm and avoid unnecessary stress. Something about her explanation did not feel right. Grandma had always insisted on greeting every person herself no matter how tired she felt. I politely asked if I could simply say hello for a few minutes before leaving. Brian stepped slightly into my path and answered before Rebecca could respond. He said Grandma needed quiet and that visitors should wait until later in the afternoon. His tone remained courteous, but the message was unmistakable. I stood there holding the pie while the family I had loved my entire life slowly returned to their conversations as though the matter had already been settled. Just as I turned toward my car, believing there was nothing else I could do without creating a scene, I heard the familiar creak of the farmhouse screen door opening behind me. Every conversation in the backyard faded into silence as the old screen door swung open. Grandma Evelyn stepped carefully onto the porch, leaning lightly on the polished wooden cane she had begun using after her hip surgery the previous winter. At 83 years old, her movements had become slower, but there was still a quiet strength about her that everyone recognized. She looked across the yard with gentle curiosity before her eyes settled on me standing near the driveway holding the pecan pie. The warm smile that immediately spread across her face disappeared the moment she noticed the distance between us. She slowly looked from me to Rebecca, then to Brian, and finally toward the group gathered around the long tables. Without raising her voice, she asked a simple question that no one answered. She wanted to know why I was standing so far away instead of sitting beside the rest of the family. Rebecca hurried toward the porch with an uneasy smile. She gently explained that there had been a misunderstanding and that everyone was simply trying to keep the reunion organized because so many relatives had arrived. Grandma listened quietly without interrupting. When Rebecca finished speaking, Grandma asked another question. She wanted to know whether she had personally invited me. I nodded softly while holding up the handwritten invitation that I had folded inside my purse before making the drive. Grandma recognized her own handwriting immediately. She turned toward the family again and asked why an invited guest had not been welcomed. No one answered. Finally Brian spoke, choosing his words carefully. He explained that several relatives believed I had become disconnected from the family after moving away. He added that many people felt the reunion should focus on those who remained closely involved in family life throughout the year. Grandma listened without changing her expression. Then she slowly walked down the porch steps until she stood only a few feet away from me. She reached out, gently took the pecan pie from my hands, and smiled exactly the way she always had when I was a little girl. She thanked me for remembering her favorite dessert. Then she quietly slipped her free arm around my shoulders. That simple gesture seemed to freeze everyone in place. Grandma turned toward the assembled relatives and reminded them that families were not measured by attendance records or mailing addresses. She said life sometimes carried people to different towns, different jobs, and different seasons, but none of those changes erased the love shared between people who belonged to one another. Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried remarkable weight. She then looked directly at Rebecca and asked who had decided that one of her grandchildren no longer belonged at the family table. Rebecca lowered her eyes without answering. A few other relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Before anyone else could speak, Grandma invited me to walk beside her back toward the tables. As we slowly crossed the yard together, I noticed several unopened folders resting near the center of the largest table beside pitchers of iced tea and serving bowls. They looked strangely out of place at what was supposed to be a family reunion. Grandma quietly noticed me looking at them. Without stopping, she leaned slightly closer and whispered that today's gathering was never only about seeing family. There was something important everyone had been waiting to discuss, and before the afternoon was over, every person sitting at those tables would finally understand why she had insisted that I be there. Grandma Evelyn led me to the long wooden table and insisted that I sit beside her, exactly where my father used to sit every summer. No one questioned her decision. The cheerful conversations that normally filled the reunion had disappeared, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to settle over the entire backyard. Family members exchanged uncertain glances while pretending to arrange plates or refill glasses of lemonade. I noticed several unfamiliar faces dressed in business attire sitting near the end of the table. They were introduced as Mr. Harrison, Grandma's attorney, and Mrs. Collins, her financial advisor. Their presence confirmed what Grandma had quietly hinted only moments earlier. This gathering involved far more than grilled chicken, homemade desserts, and family memories. After everyone had taken their seats, Grandma slowly stood, resting both hands on the back of her chair. She thanked everyone for making the trip to the farmhouse and spoke warmly about the traditions that had brought generations of the Whitmore family together beneath those old oak trees. She recalled how my grandfather had planted each tree shortly after returning home from military service, believing that one day their children and grandchildren would gather beneath the growing branches. As she spoke, many relatives smiled at the familiar stories they had heard countless times. Then her expression became more thoughtful. She admitted that during the past year she had begun noticing something that deeply troubled her. Conversations had gradually shifted away from family memories and toward property values, inheritance questions, and future ownership of the farmhouse. She said that several relatives had visited more frequently than usual, not to spend time with her, but to discuss renovations, land surveys, and financial planning. No one interrupted her. The silence became heavier with every sentence. Grandma explained that she had spent months praying, reflecting, and meeting privately with trusted advisors because she wanted to ensure that everything she and Grandpa had built would continue serving the family instead of dividing it. She then looked directly at me before addressing everyone else. She said there was one reason she had personally invited every grandchild, including those who now lived far away. She wanted to see how each person would treat another family member when they believed nothing important depended on that choice. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rebecca quietly looked down at her folded hands. Brian stared toward the pasture beyond the fence without speaking. Grandma gently thanked me for making the drive and bringing her favorite pecan pie, adding that kindness often revealed itself through the smallest acts of thoughtfulness. She then asked a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. If a family could exclude one granddaughter from a reunion simply because her circumstances had changed, what would prevent them from excluding anyone else when life became difficult? The word settled heavily across the backyard. Even the children playing in the distance seemed quieter, as though the entire property understood the importance of the moment. Grandma finally nodded toward Mr. Harrison, who opened one of the large folders resting on the table. Before reading anything, he explained that Mrs. Whitmore had recently completed an updated estate plan after months of careful consideration. However, before discussing legal documents, she had instructed him to observe one final family gathering exactly as it unfolded naturally. Only then would she decide whether her original plans truly reflected the values she wanted to leave behind. Hearing those words, I realized the reunion had never been a coincidence. Every welcome, every conversation, and every decision made that afternoon had quietly become part of a lesson Grandma had been preparing long before any of us arrived at the farmhouse. Mr. Harrison carefully closed the folder without reading a single page. He explained that Grandma Evelyn had changed her instructions only that morning after witnessing everything that happened before she stepped onto the porch. According to her wishes, no legal documents would be discussed until everyone first understood why she believed the family had reached such an important turning point. Grandma thanked him with a quiet smile before speaking again. She admitted that growing older had taught her many lessons about money, property, and success, but none of those lessons compared to what she had learned about people. She explained that difficult times never truly changed a person's character. They simply revealed qualities that had always been present beneath the surface. When my father became ill, she watched relatives offer support without expecting anything in return. She also watched others slowly become more interested in practical matters than personal relationships. She did not judge anyone for building successful careers or comfortable lives. She was proud of every accomplishment represented around the table. What troubled her was something entirely different. She feared that the family had begun measuring one another by financial success instead of kindness, convenience instead of commitment, and appearances instead of love. Her words carried no anger, only quiet disappointment. She then surprised everyone by describing private visits she had received during the previous year. Several relatives had encouraged her to sell the farmhouse while real estate prices remained high. Others suggested dividing the land early to avoid future disagreements. One cousin even proposed converting part of the property into a luxury event venue after her passing. Grandma calmly explained that none of those conversations had offended her because every suggestion came from practical reasoning. What saddened her was that very few visitors asked how lonely she felt after losing Grandpa, whether she needed help maintaining the garden, or simply wanted to spend an afternoon listening to old family stories. The backyard remained completely silent. I noticed tears forming in the eyes of Aunt Linda, who quietly reached for a tissue. Rebecca stared down at the untouched plate in front of her. Brian slowly removed his sunglasses and rubbed his forehead. Grandma then turned toward me. She reminded everyone that although I lived in another town and no longer owned the family house, I still called her almost every Sunday evening. I mailed birthday cards, remembered anniversaries, and visited whenever my work schedule allowed. She laughed softly as she mentioned the pecan pie sitting beside her chair, saying that every year I somehow remembered the one dessert Grandpa loved most. I felt embarrassed hearing those small gestures described in front of everyone because I had never considered them extraordinary. To me, they were simply what family did for one another. Grandma gently squeezed my hand before looking back at the group. She explained that love was rarely demonstrated through dramatic moments. More often it appeared in ordinary acts that many people overlooked because they seemed too small to matter. Mr. Harrison quietly reopened the folder and placed several documents on the table without revealing their contents. Grandma announced that before any signatures were discussed, she wanted each person present to answer one simple question honestly. If there were no inheritance, no valuable property, and no financial benefit waiting at the end of her life, would they still have gathered beneath these old oak trees with the same enthusiasm they had shown that afternoon? The question lingered in the warm summer air, and for the first time since arriving at the reunion, no one seemed certain they truly wanted to hear the answer. For several moments no one attempted to answer Grandma Evelyn's question. The only sounds came from a gentle breeze moving through the oak trees and the distant chirping of birds beyond the pasture fence. Faces that had once appeared confident now reflected uncertainty. Finally, Uncle Robert cleared his throat and admitted that perhaps everyone had become distracted by practical matters. He insisted no one intended to hurt anyone's feelings. Grandma nodded kindly but reminded him that good intentions could never erase the pain caused by careless actions. She explained that people rarely remembered every word spoken during difficult moments, but they always remembered how those moments made them feel. She then looked around the table and quietly asked everyone to think back to the first thing they had noticed when I arrived. Had they seen a granddaughter carrying her favorite pecan pie across the yard, or had they noticed an aging car, a modest wardrobe, and someone whose life no longer appeared as successful as everyone else's? Her question settled heavily over the gathering. Rebecca slowly raised her eyes and admitted she had convinced herself she was protecting family harmony by limiting attendance to those she believed remained closely involved. She confessed that after several conversations about the future of the farmhouse, she had begun seeing relatives through the lens of responsibility, financial contribution, and visible success, rather than simple family connection. Brian quietly agreed that he had supported her decision without questioning whether it reflected Grandma's values or merely his own assumptions. Hearing their honesty did not erase what had happened, but it changed the atmosphere completely. Grandma smiled gently because she had always believed that admitting a mistake required far more courage than pretending one had never been made. She explained that every family experienced seasons of misunderstanding. What mattered was whether people chose humility after recognizing the truth. Mr. Harrison then placed another folder beside Grandma. Instead of opening legal documents, he removed several handwritten letters. Grandma explained that over the previous 2 years she had asked different family members to help with small tasks around the farmhouse. Some repaired broken fences, others helped clean storage rooms, while a few simply spent afternoons drinking tea and listening to old stories. She kept notes about every visit, not because she intended to reward anyone, but because she wanted to remember the moments that brought genuine comfort during the loneliest years of her life. To my surprise, she mentioned that many names appeared throughout those pages, including relatives who had never spoken about their quiet acts of kindness. Aunt Linda often brought homemade soup without announcing her visit. Cousin Mark repaired the front porch after a storm. Even Rebecca had spent several weekends organizing family photographs. Grandma thanked each of them sincerely before explaining why those memories mattered. None of those acts had increased the value of the property. None appeared in bank statements or legal records. Yet they represented the true wealth of a family. She then looked directly at me once more and recalled the evenings we spent talking on the telephone after Grandpa passed away. She said our conversations were rarely about money or inheritance. We usually laughed about old recipes, forgotten childhood adventures, or Grandpa's stubborn determination to fix everything himself. She smiled through quiet tears and admitted those simple conversations often carried her through difficult nights. Looking around the table again, she softly reminded everyone that inheritance should never become the reason people stayed close. Love had to come first, or every gift eventually lost its meaning. As she rested both hands upon the folder in front of her, she calmly announced that the time had finally come to explain why she had completely rewritten her estate plan only 3 weeks before the reunion. Grandma Evelyn rested her hands gently on the folder while every pair of eyes remained fixed upon her. The afternoon sun filtered through the old oak branches, casting shifting patterns across the long wooden tables where generations of the Whitmore family had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and countless ordinary Sundays. She smiled softly before explaining that rewriting her estate plan had not been an impulsive decision. It had been the result of nearly 2 years of careful thought, prayer, and observation. She had watched every visit, every telephone call, every unexpected act of kindness, and every conversation that took place when people believed no one else was paying attention. She admitted that the process had not been easy because she loved every person sitting before her. However, love did not require pretending that every choice carried the same weight. Mr. Harrison carefully opened the revised estate documents while Grandma continued speaking. She explained that many families divided inheritances equally because fairness seemed simple. She respected that approach, but after losing Grandpa she realized something important. Equality and stewardship were not always the same thing. The farmhouse represented more than valuable land. It held decades of birthdays, holiday dinners, family prayers, and memories that could never be measured in dollars. Whoever accepted responsibility for the property needed to value those memories before considering financial opportunities. She quietly admitted that several relatives had encouraged her to sell the farm while property prices remained exceptionally strong. Others had already discussed dividing acreage into residential lots. None of those ideas were unreasonable from a business perspective, yet every suggestion focused on what could be gained rather than what could be preserved. Then Grandma surprised everyone by reaching beneath the folder and lifting an old leather scrapbook onto the table. Its worn cover showed years of careful use. She slowly opened the first pages, revealing photographs of Grandpa planting the young oak trees, my father repairing fences beside him, family picnics from decades earlier, and handwritten recipes passed down through 3 generations. She explained that every photograph represented people choosing one another long before anyone imagined discussing inheritances. Looking directly at Rebecca, she gently reminded her that success should never convince anyone they had become more valuable than those whose lives had followed different paths. Rebecca quietly wiped away tears and whispered that she finally understood what Grandma had been trying to teach all afternoon. Brian nodded in agreement, admitting that somewhere along the way they had confused protecting family assets with protecting family relationships. Grandma thanked them for their honesty because sincere humility always deserved respect. She then asked me to stand beside her. Feeling every eye upon me, I reluctantly rose from my chair. Grandma slipped the scrapbook into my hands and smiled warmly. She explained that years earlier Grandpa had asked her to give it only to the family member who understood that memories could never be replaced once they were sold, forgotten, or ignored. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the book because I knew it was worth far more emotionally than anything written inside legal documents. Mr. Harrison then cleared his throat and prepared to read the revised estate plan aloud. Before he spoke a single sentence, Grandma made one final request. She wanted everyone to remember that whatever they heard during the next few minutes should never become the reason they loved one another more or less. The decisions inside those pages reflected responsibility rather than favoritism, stewardship rather than reward, and the hope that future generations would continue gathering beneath these same oak trees for reasons far more important than inheritance. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, unfolded the first page of Grandma Evelyn's revised estate plan, and began reading with the careful, measured voice of someone who understood that every sentence carried the weight of an entire family's future. He explained that the estate had been structured differently from previous versions because Mrs. Whitmore wanted every decision to reflect stewardship, responsibility, and family unity rather than simple financial distribution. The farmhouse itself would never be sold while Grandma remained alive. After her passing, ownership would transfer into a protected family trust rather than becoming the personal property of any single individual. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks because this was clearly not what they had expected. Mr. Harrison continued reading. The trust required that the farmhouse remain available for future Whitmore family reunions, holiday gatherings, and community events that honored the family's history. No beneficiary would have the authority to force a sale without unanimous agreement from every voting member of the trust board. Then he paused before reading the next section. Grandma had appointed one primary family steward responsible for preserving the farmhouse, coordinating maintenance, organizing annual reunions, and ensuring that future generations understood the property's history. The position did not provide greater financial benefit than anyone else received. Instead, it carried additional responsibility. Every expense would be reviewed annually by independent advisors, and every major decision required written approval from the trust board. Mr. Harrison slowly looked up before reading the name. He announced that Claire Whitmore had been selected as the first family steward. For several seconds no one reacted. The only sound came from the wind gently moving through the oak branches overhead. I stared at Grandma in complete disbelief. I quietly shook my head and whispered that there had to be some mistake. I reminded everyone that I no longer even lived nearby and that several cousins possessed far more business experience than I did. Grandma smiled warmly and reached for my hand. She explained that stewardship was never determined by income, professional titles, or convenience. It was determined by the willingness to protect something valuable even when there was little personal reward for doing so. She reminded everyone that I had continued showing up, calling, writing, and caring without knowing there would ever be legal documents connected to those choices. Rebecca slowly stood from her chair with tears already forming in her eyes. She apologized publicly for trying to prevent me from attending the reunion. She admitted that somewhere along the way she had allowed success and appearances to influence her judgment. Brian followed by acknowledging that he had supported the decision instead of questioning whether it reflected the values Grandpa and Grandma had spent their entire lives teaching the family. Neither apology erased the hurt I had experienced walking across the yard earlier that afternoon, but both felt sincere. Grandma quietly thanked them because honesty always marked the beginning of healing. She explained that families did not become stronger by pretending mistakes never happened. They became stronger by recognizing them before pride made reconciliation impossible. Mr. Harrison then continued reading additional provisions establishing educational scholarships for future generations, charitable donations to the local community, and annual family service projects to honor Grandpa's memory. Every section emphasized shared responsibility instead of individual privilege. Looking around the table, I realized Grandma had quietly accomplished something extraordinary. She had transformed what many expected to become a conversation about inheritance into a lesson about character. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, I no longer felt like the granddaughter who had almost been turned away at the driveway. I felt like I had finally returned home. Although the estate plan had finally been explained, no one hurried to leave the table. The afternoon had changed every expectation people carried with them when they arrived at the farmhouse. Instead of discussing property values or future ownership, relatives found themselves reflecting on conversations they had ignored, visits they had postponed, and assumptions they had quietly accepted without question. Grandma Evelyn remained seated beside me, gently turning the pages of the old family scrapbook while grandchildren and great-nieces slowly gathered around her chair. For the first time that day, the attention centered on family memories instead of legal documents. She pointed to faded photographs showing Grandpa teaching children how to fish in the nearby creek, harvest vegetables from the garden, and repair old fences together. Every picture reminded us that the farmhouse had never become meaningful because of its market value. It became meaningful because ordinary people filled it with extraordinary love over many decades. Rebecca approached me quietly while the others looked through the scrapbook. She apologized again, this time without anyone listening except the two of us. She admitted that after building a successful career and moving into a larger home, she gradually began believing that accomplishment naturally reflected character. Seeing me arrive in an older car wearing simple clothes had unconsciously reinforced assumptions she never realized she was making. She said the moment Grandma placed her arm around my shoulders, she suddenly recognized how shallow those assumptions truly were. I thanked her for speaking honestly because I understood how easy it was for people to judge one another without intending harm. We embraced gently, and the tension that had shadowed the entire afternoon seemed to lift a little more. Brian soon joined us, carrying 3 glasses of iced tea. Smiling awkwardly, he admitted that he had been thinking less about family and more about practical business decisions for several years. Grandpa's farmhouse had gradually become an investment opportunity in his mind rather than the place where he learned to ride bicycles, roast marshmallows, and celebrate Christmas with cousins. He quietly thanked Grandma for reminding him what he had nearly forgotten. As the conversations became warmer, Grandma asked everyone to help clear the tables together before dessert. It was a simple request, but something beautiful happened. People who had spent the afternoon sitting in separate groups naturally began working beside relatives they had barely spoken to in years. Children laughed while carrying empty pitchers. Adults folded chairs, washed serving bowls, and shared stories that had nothing to do with inheritance. Even the unfamiliar financial advisors smiled as they watched the family slowly rediscover itself. Later that evening, after most of the dishes had been cleaned, Grandma invited everyone to gather beneath the oldest oak tree planted by Grandpa more than half a century earlier. She explained that every reunion had always ended there because Grandpa believed families should finish the day standing together before returning to separate lives. Looking around the circle of familiar faces, she quietly admitted that earlier that afternoon she feared the Whitmore family had begun drifting too far apart to find its way back. Now she believed something much better was possible. She reminded everyone that forgiveness did not erase mistakes, but it allowed people to stop allowing yesterday's failures to define tomorrow's relationships. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Kentucky hills, I realized that the most valuable part of Grandma's estate had never been written inside legal documents. It was unfolding quietly beneath the oak tree where an entire family had finally begun remembering what it truly meant to belong. The months following the reunion brought changes that no one could have predicted when the day first began with uncomfortable silence near the driveway. Grandma Evelyn's new estate plan officially took effect, but its greatest influence had very little to do with legal documents. Family members who had rarely spoken outside holidays began calling one another again. Cousins organized monthly visits to the farmhouse, not because they were required to do so, but because they genuinely wanted to spend time together. Rebecca volunteered to digitize thousands of old family photographs so future generations would never lose them. Brian offered his construction experience to repair the aging barn exactly as Grandpa would have done decades earlier. Even relatives who lived across the country began scheduling vacations around family gatherings rather than treating reunions as optional obligations. I accepted my responsibilities as family steward with equal parts gratitude and humility. Every important decision involving the farmhouse was shared openly with the trust board exactly as Grandma intended. We restored the old front porch, repaired weathered fences, replanted Grandpa's vegetable garden, and converted one unused storage room into a small family history library filled with photographs, journals, handwritten recipes, military medals, and letters spanning nearly 100 years. None of those projects dramatically increased the property's financial value, yet they strengthened something far more important. Every visitor left understanding that the Whitmore farmhouse represented a living history rather than simply a valuable piece of land. Grandma remained actively involved in every project despite insisting she was only there to offer advice. She still walked slowly through the garden each morning, stopping to admire flowers Grandpa had planted years before. Sometimes we sat together on the porch swing watching grandchildren chase butterflies across the same fields where my father and his brothers once played baseball. During those quiet afternoons she often reminded me that preserving memories required ordinary daily effort, not extraordinary moments. One autumn evening, while organizing old boxes inside the attic, we discovered a weathered wooden chest belonging to Grandpa. Inside were handwritten journals describing the earliest years of the farmhouse, newspaper clippings from the town's history, and dozens of family letters exchanged during military service, college years, and difficult seasons of life. Reading those pages together felt like welcoming long-forgotten voices back into the family. Grandma smiled as she explained that every generation faced different challenges, yet nearly every letter ended with the same reminder. Family survived because someone always chose forgiveness before pride. Inspired by those discoveries, the Trust Board unanimously approved creating an annual Whitmore Heritage Day alongside the traditional reunion. Instead of focusing only on food and conversation, every gathering would now include sharing family stories, preserving historical photographs, maintaining the farmhouse together, and welcoming younger generations into traditions that might otherwise disappear. Watching children carefully listen to Grandpa's stories recorded decades earlier reminded everyone why the farmhouse deserved protecting. It was no longer simply where our family had come from. It had become the place teaching future generations who they could become. Looking back, I often thought about the painful moment when I almost turned toward my car believing I no longer belonged. If Grandma had remained inside the house for only a few more minutes, everything might have unfolded differently. Instead, one elderly woman quietly standing beneath an old porch roof changed the direction of an entire family. She reminded us that belonging could never be earned through wealth, status, or perfect attendance at reunions. It was a gift rooted in love, strengthened by grace, and preserved whenever ordinary people chose one another over pride. Almost 3 years passed before our family truly appreciated the wisdom behind Grandma Evelyn's decisions. The annual reunions gradually became the most anticipated weekends of the year again, not because anyone expected discussions about inheritance, but because people genuinely looked forward to being together. The farmhouse echoed with laughter from children exploring the fields, cousins cooking side by side in the old kitchen, and relatives sitting on the porch long after sunset sharing stories that grew richer with each passing season. The changes were subtle at first, but they became impossible to ignore. Conversations that once centered on careers, investments, and property values slowly gave way to memories, gratitude, and plans for serving the local community together. Rebecca eventually confessed that the reunion where she nearly turned me away remained one of the most important lessons of her life. She began volunteering with organizations that helped families experiencing financial hardship because she realized how easily people judged others without understanding the battles they quietly carried. Brian started mentoring young business owners in town, encouraging them to build companies rooted in integrity rather than appearance. Watching those transformations reminded me that genuine humility often produced lasting change long after embarrassment faded. Grandma never mentioned that difficult afternoon again unless someone else brought it up. She believed the purpose of painful experiences was not to relive them endlessly but to allow them to shape wiser decisions in the future. Whenever younger relatives asked why the farmhouse trust required unanimous agreement before any major decision, she simply smiled and answered that important things deserved patient conversations instead of hurried conclusions. Her wisdom slowly became part of the family's culture rather than merely advice offered by the oldest generation. One spring afternoon I received a handwritten letter from a distant cousin who had attended the reunion only occasionally while growing up. He explained that watching Grandma stand beside me had inspired him to repair a broken relationship with his own sister after nearly 10 years of silence. He admitted that pride had convinced him reconciliation could wait until a better time. After seeing how quickly families could drift apart through simple assumptions, he decided that waiting no longer made sense. Reading those words reminded me that acts of courage often reached people we never expected. During the following reunion, Grandma asked everyone to gather beneath Grandpa's oldest oak tree before dinner. She held the familiar family scrapbook against her chest and thanked every person for helping preserve traditions she once feared might disappear. Looking around the circle of faces, she quietly admitted that she no longer worried about what would happen after she was gone. She believed the Whitmore family had rediscovered something much stronger than shared genetics or legal inheritance. We had rediscovered shared responsibility for one another. She explained that every generation eventually inherited far more than property. They inherited examples, habits, values, and choices that would quietly influence children not yet born. Before returning to the tables, Grandma placed the old scrapbook into my hands once again. She asked only one thing. She wanted every future reunion to begin with a story from someone who remembered where our family came from, followed by a welcome for every person who arrived, whether they came from across town or across the country. No exceptions. No conditions. Looking around at relatives embracing one another beneath the same oak trees Grandpa planted decades earlier, I realized Grandma had fulfilled the promise written inside her invitation years before. Home truly was wherever people chose to love one another, especially when doing so required setting pride aside. Another 5 years quietly passed, and the Whitmore family reunion became known throughout our small Kentucky community for something no one could purchase with money. Friends often remarked that every generation seemed genuinely happy to be together. They did not know how close we had once come to losing that gift. Every summer the farmhouse welcomed new spouses, newborn grandchildren, returning college students, and neighbors who no longer had family of their own nearby. Grandma Evelyn insisted there was always room for one more chair at every table because kindness multiplied when people chose to share it. The old traditions remained unchanged. Every reunion began beneath Grandpa's oak tree with a family story, followed by a warm welcome for every guest before anyone served a single meal. Looking around those gatherings, it became almost impossible to imagine that I had once stood alone near the driveway believing I no longer belonged. One afternoon while organizing the family history library inside the restored farmhouse, I discovered another envelope tucked between the pages of Grandpa's journal. The handwriting belonged to Grandma, but the envelope had never been sealed. Across the front she had simply written, "Read only when the family is together again." During that year's reunion she asked me to open it aloud after dinner. Everyone gathered quietly beneath the porch. Lights as evening settled across the fields. Her letter explained that she had written those words shortly after Grandpa passed away, during one of the loneliest nights of her life. She admitted that grief had made her wonder whether the family would slowly drift apart once she was no longer able to bring everyone together. She feared that success, distance, busy schedules, and misunderstandings would eventually replace shared memories. Yet she also wrote that hope always grows wherever one person chooses love over pride. Reading those sentences brought tears to many eyes because every person present understood exactly what she meant. Grandma smiled gently and admitted she had almost thrown the letter away years earlier because she believed it sounded too sentimental. Now she was grateful she had kept it. She looked around at the crowded porch filled with conversations, laughter, and familiar faces stretching across 4 generations. Quietly she said that the family sitting before her had already answered every fear she once carried. No legal document could have accomplished what forgiveness had accomplished. No inheritance could have purchased what humility had restored. She thanked Rebecca for having the courage to admit her mistake years earlier because honesty had opened the door for healing. She thanked Brian for helping preserve Grandpa's barn instead of replacing it with something modern. She thanked every cousin, aunt, uncle, and grandchild who continued showing up for one another through birthdays, illnesses, celebrations, and ordinary weekends. Finally, she turned toward me with the same gentle smile she wore the afternoon she walked across the yard to meet me near the driveway. She reminded everyone that the most important decision she made had never been rewriting an estate plan. It had been refusing to allow one painful moment to define the future of an entire family. Looking around at children laughing beneath the same oak trees Grandpa planted decades earlier, I realized that belonging had never depended upon approval from relatives or invitations to reunions. It had always begun with one person brave enough to stand beside someone who felt forgotten. Because Grandma Evelyn chose to stand that day, every generation that followed inherited something far greater than land or money. We inherited a family that finally remembered how to stand together. 10 years after the reunion that changed everything, I found myself standing in the very place where I had once believed my family no longer wanted me. The gravel driveway looked exactly the same, the old white farmhouse still rested peacefully beneath the Kentucky sky, and Grandpa's towering oak trees stretched their branches wider than ever before. Yet everything else had changed. The farmhouse had become more than the center of our family. It had become a place where every new generation learned the story of why no one would ever again be left standing alone outside. The tradition Grandma Evelyn created continued faithfully each summer. Before the first meal was served, the oldest family member present welcomed every guest by name, no matter how recently they had arrived in the family or how many years had passed since their previous visit. New spouses, adopted children, distant cousins, close friends, and neighbors without relatives nearby all found seats at the same long wooden tables. Nobody asked who deserved to be there. If someone walked through the gate with respect and kindness, they belonged. One afternoon my young niece Emma, who had been born years after that unforgettable reunion, asked why the family always paused before dinner to welcome everyone individually. She had never known a different tradition. I smiled and looked toward Grandma Evelyn, now sitting comfortably on the porch wrapped in a light blanket as she watched for generations laughing together. Rather than answering myself, I carried the old family scrapbook over to Emma and invited her to sit beside Grandma. Slowly turning its worn pages, Grandma shared the story with remarkable honesty. She did not hide the painful parts or pretend our family had always been united. Instead, she explained that every strong family eventually faced moments when fear, pride, or misunderstanding threatened to pull people apart. What determined their future was never the mistake itself. It was whether someone found the courage to choose grace before resentment became permanent. Emma listened carefully before asking the simplest question of the afternoon. She wanted to know whether Grandma had been angry when people tried to send me away. Grandma smiled gently and shook her head. She admitted she had been disappointed, but anger would never have taught the lesson our family needed to learn. She explained that people often acted from fear without realizing it. Some feared losing security. Others feared change. Many feared not having enough. The only lasting answer to fear was love expressed through patient actions rather than loud words. As evening settled over the fields, our family gathered once more beneath Grandpa's oldest oak tree. Looking around the circle, I realized there were faces Grandpa himself had never met, yet somehow his values continued shaping their lives. The trust had successfully protected the farmhouse, but something far greater had also been preserved. Compassion had become our family's inheritance. Humility had become our tradition. Belonging had become our promise. Watching children run freely across the same grass where my father once played, I quietly thanked God for one ordinary afternoon years earlier when an elderly grandmother chose to walk across a backyard instead of remaining silent on her porch. That simple decision transformed embarrassment into reconciliation, strangers into family once again, and a nearly forgotten reunion into a legacy that would continue long after every legal document had faded with time.